everybody hear me all right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay, perfect. I'll just start my screen sharing. You can see my screen all right?
Yeah, and with your presentation, it's also okay.
Now that's visible, the CIDOC CRM standard?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I guess this invitation is a nice result of a CDOC meeting since I first got in contact with Anastasia and others via CDOC 2018, which was hosted in Heraklion on Crete, where I was working at the time. And so I'm glad to be invited. I am the vice chair of the CIDOC CRM SIG, and so I try to help move that standard forward. And so I'm pleased to be here to give you a little bit of an overview of what the standard is, what it's meant to do, and how you can work with it. So yes, my presentation will talk about what CIDOC CRM is, then what we use it for, how we make it, what it looks like, what you should be imagining it if you aren't familiar with it, what is actually the content, then a little bit about who uses it and how or why, and then finally some pointers to learning more about it. And I look forward to having a conversation at the end to fill in any information or ask me any questions you've ever had about CRM. Hopefully I can answer. So let's start with what is CRM. So CIDOC CRM is what's called a formal ontology. It's meant to be a core ontology for redescribing information found in museum databases and reorganizing it and connecting it across across individual databases so that you can see an integrated network of knowledge from different information sources. It's a generic model that is meant to integrate information about what has happened in the past at a human scale. And the point of doing that is to allow you to create an abstraction layer over top of individual databases you might have within a museum or across museums so that you can unify information that's stuck in particular silos and try to make more interesting queries about objects or people and events and how they interrelate and what you might learn about them. And it's the outcome of 20 years, more than 20 years of interdisciplinary collaboration between people in museology, in computer science, in mathematics, philosophy, physics, and anybody who wants to get involved. So to point to the group a bit that makes it, so the group that makes it is CIDOC CRM SIG. I'll say more about it later, but just to say it formed in 1996, and it's been pushing forward the work of making this standard for ever since then. In 2003, it's connected with the IFLA working group that makes FRBR and started a work to create an extension that combines library and museum information that's called FRBR 00. In 2006, the work of CIDOC CRM was submitted to become an ISO standard. So that's version 5.0.4, I think, of the community version, but it also gets an ISO qualification. And since then, the work has been really evolving according to community needs and different areas of work. So we've been developing what we call family models, which I'll tell you more about in a sec. Just to say that it's an evolving and growing standard. So speaking about it being a standard, there's many different ways you can talk about standards and many different things that standards can do. So what kind of standard is CIDOC CRM? Well, oftentimes in the documentation community, you come to a point where you say, we need to organize information and standardize it. Let's have a standard. So you make a standard and then you transform your data to that standard, and then situations evolve, documentation evolves, the community evolves, new information comes up, information becomes unstandardized, and you say, oh, what do we do now? Things are out of sync. Let's make a new standard and then transform to that. You end up in an endless loop and you have different organizations vying for different standards and you have different versions of the standards. So CIDOC CRM is trying to be one step above the individual standards. And so it's not trying to replace a documentation standard that you have within your museum or within a particular community, but to provide a sort of meta standard so that if you already do good documentation using some standards and you want to keep on doing that, but you also need to integrate information with others, possibly using other standards, then CIDOC CRM provides you a meta layer where you can redescribe your information and join it regardless of your initial documentation system and standard. So finally, in the what it is section, it's a specification, it's called the Formal Ontology, that allows you to redescribe your information and unify it outside of your current system of record. It consists of declarations of about 90 classes and about 160 relationships that allow you to describe the relationships between classes. So classes describe discrete parts of the world like physical objects or temporal events or people or concepts, and the relations allow you to make explicit connections between those classes, like an event was performed by somebody or an object has a part. All of these are very specified kinds of relationships, kinds of statements you can make with the CIDOC CRM language. And it has, we just had our meeting of the CIDOC CRM SIG last week. And that's something that we do 3 times a year to develop the standard. And we are going to release version 7.1. Version 7.1 is going to be the next official stable version of CIDOC CRM, which we will submit to ISO to renew the ISO standard. And so that's a big milestone and be interesting to talk about afterwards. And I want to say one more thing about this slide. And so, as I was mentioning, CIDOC CRM is this top-level ontology that allows you to redescribe your data in a general way that talks about the past. But being a top-level ontology, it's very abstract. And then if you get into particular areas of work, you need more specific concepts, more specific classes and relations to describe your information in a meaningful way. So in addition to CIDOC CRM base, as we call it, we also have the CIDOC CRM family of models. And so these are sub-models of CIDOC CRM, which are intellectually consistent with CIDOC CRM and are connected to it underneath it, but provide more specific classes and relationships to talk about different domains of work. So I'll just give you the headlines. FRBR00 I mentioned is an extension of CIDOC CRM that links to library information as documented in the FRBR standard and allows you to describe library information and basically intellectual creative processes. So it's a very useful and interesting extension. CRM Inf is an extension for describing and representing argumentation. So people saying, I believe that this thing is composed of these parts or belong to this person because of evidence X, Y, and Z. CRM size for documenting scientific analysis process and practice. So the actual methods and activities leading to having evidence for analysis. CRM Archeo is an extension for describing archaeological dig information. CRM BA is an extension for describing buildings and buildings under the particular discipline of building archaeology. So looking at the strata and reconstructing the eras of a building. CRM Dig is for provenance information about digitization processes. And CRM Geo is about it's connecting to open source standards on geographic information systems and as a way of expressing geographic information system data in a way compatible with the overall CIDOC CRM ontology. So what's it for? So I said CIDOC CRM is an ontology, and I didn't really introduce that term, so I'll introduce it quickly. So an ontology is basically could be confused with the Western notion of ontology with a capital O, as in the philosophy of being or what there is, but it's a particular sub-area of computer science which tries to borrow from philosophy and says, if we're building information structures that talk about one world, let's try to use philosophy and work with people who work in the domain to describe the key terms and relationships that they talk about and build a reusable structure that can be used to describe many databases, even if the individual database has a different format, a different way of organizing the information, but in the end, you could retranslate the information into these clear classes and relationships that describe them. So it's not about creating the picture of the world, it's about creating a picture of the world that is useful for a group of people doing similar kinds of description, similar kinds of science or research. And the point of it is to create this formalization of the knowledge in the domain, which can be expressed in these classes and relationships so that we can have, despite having many different systems, we can reorganize the information and re-represent it together in one unit, in one graph, using this limited set of classes and relationships. It's very important to stress that it's talking about a real world, so it's not for describing fiction or anything like that. It's trying to give you a miniature language for describing the things that you talk about in museology and link together facts from different organizations in one graph. So I mentioned that term already, lingua franca. So the idea is that these classes and relationships that we make, they're actually general level concepts that arise from museology. These are not really terms in anybody's language, but they're abstractions that apply to museology. So that's why the exercise of translation is particularly interesting because you're translating the concept and not the term, which means that we really can create a lingua franca where people can use CIDOC CRM in Ukrainian or French or whatever other language, and yet be linking their data under concepts and relationships which are the same, and therefore hopefully getting interesting results. And of course, by formalizing everything, it means that these classes and relationships we build should be processable by machines using logical algorithms, but they should be readable by humans so that we can interpret what the data means prima facie. The reason we make this thing in the first place is to try to allow people to move out of their data silos. So if you think, I mean, I've also come from a museological, I mean, I have a philosophy background, but I've worked a lot in museum and research institute contexts on different projects where people create very analytic information about a subject of study, which is incredibly exciting, but that information lives within a very limited space, maybe just for the researcher for themselves, or maybe for them and a few colleagues. But the work that they're doing is actually of interest and useful to colleagues around the world who don't know anything about it. And so in a traditional, in our traditional workflows, I mean, we make a publication and hopefully somebody reads about it and then they try to get in contact with us. And the sort of dream would be, if you're doing work that is analytic documentation that feeds into documentation that gives precise information about the same objects from a different perspective, from conservation or from art historical analysis or what have you, that you can merge this data into a unified graph, be able to reference that information to the world and in publications, and be able to go back and have a discussion with people, either based on publications or based on a knowledge graph, and that way try to increase knowledge and our ability to communicate scientifically across borders. So that's the sort of dream. Getting a little bit more grounded, what can you actually do with CIDOC CRM if you get your hands on it? So I've written down basically 4 use scenarios. So on the one side, we can talk about modeling or creating something anew. So if you were starting a new documentation project or a new area of analysis, and you wanted to adopt CIDOC CRM to make your data compatible with this standard and with other people's data long term, then you can use it as a reference source in order to guide the way that you build your data structure and the way you collect your data, and essentially use it as a way to guide your modeling practice to build an information system. Another aspect in the creation part is that you may say, okay, CIDOC CRM sounds good to me. I want to integrate data with another project, with another department, within my museum, across these museums. But my research or our area of documentation is more specialized. We need more information than CIDOC CRM can capture. Then you can use it as a top-level ontology to give you a practice and a theory for how to develop your ontology, and you can make an extension of CIDOC CRM to cover your research or documentation scenario. Then there's 2 other uses that you can use it for. If you already have data and you simply want to, if you already have data and you want to integrate it across a couple databases or some institutions, then you can use it as a tool for making a mapping of your existing data to the ontology. You map another data source to the ontology in the same way, and you can re-express your data in usually an RDF or some triples format, which we can come back to because I'm not going to explain it now. And that's a good use scenario. And then the last use scenario that's worth pointing to is that there are now quite a number of projects that are working at allowing you to use ontologies to create your data structures within your information systems natively. And so you can create native CIDOC CRM data from the start. And we'll see a couple examples of that in a second. So I hope I'm speaking at a reasonable pace for the translators whose work I'm appreciating already in the middle of this. So on to how this is made. So CIDOC CRM is an international standard. It is under the aegis of the International Council or Committee for Documentation. So it's a subcommittee within that organization. We meet 3 to 4 times a year, usually 3 now. Our goal, it's a completely volunteer organization, is to support the maintenance and development of this standard and all of its submodels. Because CIDOC CRM is not standing still, it's under constant development. So we get new information, we get posed new questions, and we reconsider the standard, and we add things, we change things. We try to do the change management in a way that we don't make anything backward incompatible. Basically, if you want to have a standard that's alive, you need to take new information into account and create new editions of the standard. So that's why we've arrived at 7.1 now, and we'll make a new ISO standard, and we will also release documentation around how to migrate from an older version to a new version. We're made up of experts from many different fields. The CIDOC CRM Special Interest Group is what SIG stands for. Its membership is based on institution, so you don't join as George or Sally. You join via an institution that commits to supporting the work over longer term. And then there's a representative, which could be George or Sally. And the way that we move things forward is basically we have a mailing list. People who are interested in using CRM join the mailing list. They can follow the conversations, and then when people find that there's something to discuss, a problem with the standard or a new thing to consider, then you propose an issue. This gets documented on the website. There's a discussion, and then we either have email votes where we decide the issue, or at one of these meetings 3 times a year, we vote on it and we try to come to a solution, document that, and evolve the standard. All of this happens with democratic voting. And to say a little bit about, okay, so how do you actually do that? How do you arrive at a good ontology? This slide tries to present that. So basically, what we do is we try to start from evidence. We start to move from ground up. And our evidence is data structures from the cultural heritage field, and data visualizations, data input forms, and that sort of thing, which we study to understand the kinds of statements that people are trying to make about different kinds of objects in the world in the study of cultural heritage, in the documentation of cultural heritage. And then we abstract that and try to define the classes and relations in CIDOC CRM that would be able to cover many, many different databases that look different and have a different set of tables, but basically talk about and have information about the same kinds of things. So the science and the art is to find just the limited kinds of things and kind of relations that you need to talk about everything that could go in a museum database, in a conservation database, and so on and so forth. And we do that really by saying everything that's documented in a museological collection and in any scientific, scholarly, cultural heritage documentation is really making statements about a real world. And so we can use that to abstract and say, okay, at the end of the day, what are the real world things that are being talked about, and what is being claimed about them? And when you take that perspective, then you can generate these high level classes and relationships, which are the language of CIDOC CRM, and which are supposed to approximate the research and the thought that a researcher or documentalist is doing, and the knowledge they're generating in using database X, Y, or Z. And some other points to make on this slide are that so by creating this higher level abstraction, obviously our goal is more on creating information recall than information precision. So we're not making tiny subclasses for every individual kind of dagger or that sort of thing. That goes to the work of creating thesauri. We're trying to, the ontology preferences recall over analytic information. And two other points to make on that. I think I'm not too pressed for time. When we're developing the standard, we try to not to make major mistakes. Let's put it that way. So if we declare a class or a relationship, we know that people in principle are using it to represent their information and unify it with other databases. So this means that this monotonic extensibility means that we want to make changes that do not result in reconsidering a class and saying what we thought was one thing is two things, for example. Because if we make a class and we say all things under this class are one thing, and then we decide, no, it's two things, then for people who've used that version of CIDOC CRM, if they have 5,000 things underneath class X, now they have to decide, is it A or is it B? And obviously that's a pain. Just checking the chat in case there's a problem. Okay, great. Last point on this slide is CIDOC CRM is trying to be ground up, so it works from data structures that are given as examples for issues, and then it's not trying to be philosophical or top-down. So we don't create classes because other ontologies said it would be good to have class X, Y, or Z. We create the classes organically because from the data that's presented from participating institutions, we discover something new that isn't described, that should be described because it's useful to everyone, and then we add it in. Oops. And then we get to this slide, which I'm sorry I copied over from a different type, so it looks quite messy. But just to try to give you, this is a classic CIDOC CRM slide, but it does tell quite a story. So basically, the idea of implementing CIDOC CRM would be that you have different data structures, which is the bottom row here, local data structures, which for very logical organizational reasons probably have to stay those data structures. Systems of record that are useful for Department X or Department Y because we paid for it or we built it or whatever. But they talk about the same world. So people record in the systems that they use to record, but they can create a mapping of their data to CIDOC CRM using the major classes and the major relationships that are offered through that language. So they create the major connections using the big classes of CIDOC CRM, like E24 physical thing, something like that, or man-made physical thing. And then they use thesauri to make very fine detailed distinctions, like it's a, you know, such and such dagger type or what have you. And the result of that, if multiple data sources map their data and transform it to CIDOC CRM classes and relationships, is that you get a re-expression of things, of all this knowledge that's located in these different silos in an integrated semantic data graph, which creates new connections between object X, which is referred to in this data source, but I didn't have the knowledge that was also underwent a conservation analysis, which is referred to in this data source. That's basically the nutshell of the integration scenario that we aim to support. Do I have to talk about this anymore? just to say, so this comes about, again, empirically. So it's in conversation with specialists like yourselves who are trying to represent certain data that we come up with the classes and relationships. And another thing that we try to do in an actual implementation of CDOC CRM is that you would kind of create competence questions. So if we integrate our data using CDOC CRM across these two data sources, what is it we want to learn? And how would that be expressed as a query on semantic data so that at the end of the day, you don't just do intellectual exercises of merging data, but you see that you can merge data and learn something new. I'll skip over that. It's not too important. And I'd like to move on to what does it look like. And here's where I'll show you the top level classes and relationships of CDOC CRM and hopefully explain them in a way that makes them look intelligible to you. So CDOC CRM has these 90 classes and 160 relationships I'm referring to. And that's often a barrier for people thinking about it. They think, well, that sounds like a lot to learn to me. And I'm interested in doing documentation or in studying the information. I'm not interested in doing conceptual modeling. So I'm not sure if I want to follow this path anymore. This diagram is meant to show the basic pattern of CDOC CRM, which repeats everywhere. So if you understand the intellectual content of this diagram, you get the content of the rest of CDOC CRM, basically. CDOC CRM is what we call an event-oriented model. And the event-oriented model is designed for cultural heritage, and it's chosen because the idea is if you want to integrate information about objects in the past, what is the way of representing the data that is most capable of generating the most connections between the things that we'll talk about so that we get the most richness of information in interconnecting different objects of conversation, objects of documentation. So in CDOC CRM, everything goes through an event of different types. So if you have time documented somewhere, that means that you have an event. Is the time about a person? It means you have a birth. Is it the time about an object? It could be the production. It could be the conservation. It could be the find time. Different events. And when you instantiate that event node, when you create an event for your time and don't just say, George, 1979, object, 2012, but you say, George, birth, 1979, object, find, 2012. Then you have a new piece of, a new node for connecting information. You can enrich with additional data. So you can talk about who was involved in the event. You can talk about when the event occurred. You can specify different objects, whether they be physical or conceptual, that were involved in the event. So that's the argumentation between for doing event-based modeling. And also in this diagram, you see the major kinds of classes that we have in CDOC CRM, and you see a color code there. So on the one hand, we have temporal entities, which are things that have time, as I just said now. So it could be something as limited as a birth. It could be something as broad as a war or a geological period. We have a notion of actors. Actors are either people or institutions that have the capacity to act in a legally responsible way in some sort of event. So they're the only people who have agency in the CDOC CRM language or world. We have physical things, which are something that comes into being one time and it has matter, and that's essential to its identity. So it's a table, and if you smash the table to a certain extent, it no longer exists. We have the notion of conceptual object. Conceptual objects are ideas. They can only be the products of a human mind, and then we subdivide it into things like symbolic objects and propositional objects and visual items, these sorts of things. But basically, they have a different parameter for existence. So they can only come to be because there was an event that somebody thought of it. But once it's thought of, it will never stop existing unless it's completely forgotten, which means that if I've written it down somewhere, that it's carried by a book, that it's carried by a painting, or somebody remembers it, it exists, and it can exist in multiple places. So it can be on my copy of this Shakespeare volume, or your copy of that Shakespeare volume, in distinction to a physical object, which just is one thing, it's there, and once it's destroyed, it's gone. And then I'll come back to appellations and types, and we have places, and places are just geometric descriptions either on the earth or on an object of where something can occur. And finally, we have some classes that come back all the time. Appellation, which is a subtype of concept, and type, which is also a subtype of concept. And they come back all the time because they're very consistent features of documentation and reasoning about the past. People give names to things. So anything that's identified with one of these classes can get many names. And likewise, people classify and give types to things for different reasons at different times. So likewise, any object that's classified in the ontology can receive many types. So do I have like 8 more minutes? Would that be okay? I think I can get
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will not spend too much time on these diagrams. I just want to point them out and say, we have built some new diagrams for version 7.1, which basically look like this, and it picks out the most abstract part of the ontology. So this might seem quite abstract, but we'll start creating smaller level diagrams which describe more particular concrete documentation scenarios. So these are to give the overview of what the language can do, but in the end you would use a smaller set of classes and relationships that talked about your scenario. So this slide is to give you the main entities of CIDOC CRM, and it's so basically, and some of the main properties. So if you read it, if you see these things that are a heavy arrow with a white top, that means that this class is a subclass of this class, of another class. So anything you can say about a higher class, you can say of the lower class. So here the diagram is just saying, at the top of CIDOC CRM, we give you a class called entity, which can talk about anything. And so of anything, you can say it has a type or it has a name. And then reading down this diagram, you get more power of expression in your language. So we in class called temporal entity, which is a subclass of CRM entity, and it allows you to talk about time spans. So if you have information about 1956 to 1960, you're somehow going to need this class. And then the ontology specializes into major branches, which are what I told you about before, basically temporal entities, physical things, conceptual objects. So you can actually see that here on the right. So we have persistent items, which are all static items. And so we have physical things, conceptual objects, and actors, and they can participate in events. Events, because they're a subclass of period, can take place somewhere. So you start having the information, start being able to model quite complex information, even with these very few classes. And then there are special kind of events which either lead to a persistent item coming to be or going out of existence. And so then we have some high level classes for beginning of existence and end of existence. Now, actually teaching the CIDOC CRM, if you're going to apply it, I usually do at least an hour, and there are 3 or 4 hour versions of introducing the thing. So I'm going to fly over things now. So if you don't feel that you come away with an idea exactly of how to apply this, that's just because I didn't spend enough time with you. And I can certainly share with you some online videos where if you want to learn more, you can just follow. This is just to give you the high-level idea of temporal reasoning that you can do with CIDOC CRM. And you see this big box here with a bunch of interesting sounding properties: starts before, the end of, starts before with a start of. These are new properties that were introduced for version 7.1 or with 7.1, and they replace Allen operator reasoning. So they're very much for archaeological and large-scale temporal reasoning, where you don't have dates, but you want to make documentation of relative chronology, and you want to take into account that things are, in Allen operators, things must abut each other in time. So you have this thing starts that thing, and they have no overlap. These are complex properties for describing the overlaps that can occur between different time units. And then for anything that's in time, you can talk about its time span, and you can talk about when it's definitely happening or when it was probably happening. You can talk about general durations, and then you can talk about parthood of time. So whether this P9 consists of is to say that there's a proper part of some sort of event, as opposed to falls within, which is there's a relative part, there's an inclusion. So I don't know, my birth happens within, I don't know, the First Republic of Canada, but it's not an essential part of the First Republic of Canada. And then condition state, which is about talking about the present physical condition of an object for conservation. This is high-level reasoning about spatial information. Not a lot of things have changed between CIDOC CRM 5 and CIDOC CRM 7.1 with regards to that. Things that have come in are extensions that have been guided by this work on working with geographic information system data. So now we have these new properties for places defined by and having some place within or contains, which are properties that are trying to let you connect to data values you create in a GIS to give much more accurate data values to places that you're talking about. So I won't get into the rest, I'll just highlight that difference. And then space-time volumes are a major addition to 7.1, and they sit at the top of the ontology, and basically if they sound science fiction-y or like you wouldn't know what to do with them, then you can ignore them because they sit at the top of the ontology and you use the special classes you need. But they do have a function, and it's an in-research function. So basically, the space-time volume allows you to document something both with regards to its temporal and geographic projections. So if you think of an object, I don't know, a table that's created and it's moved through its entire provenance history. So it was bought by so-and-so and stayed in their salon until 1822, and then it was bought by so-and-so and moved to a warehouse where it stayed until 1876, and so on and so forth. And you're interested in tracking not just these events that glue its life together, but also specifically where it was and what it might have encountered at a particular time. Then you can use the space-time volumes to represent where things are over time. So that's a very short explanation of short time volumes. But I would like to take the last 2 minutes to talk about who's using CIDOC CRM and how you can use it, and then give the floor to you, hopefully not having taken too much time. So in a nutshell, these are some organizations and groups that are using CIDOC CRM, and I would classify them and document them into different kinds. So there are groups like linked art, FADOS, and linked conservation data, which are basically discipline organized groups that have said, we want to organize, we create data about the same things, and we want to adopt an ontology and specify it for our work so that we can create a merged graph of knowledge to share with our community. So linked art is doing that for art collections. FADOS is doing it for photo archives, and linked conservation data is aiming to do it for conservationists. Then we have sort of European project style work where there are projects like Ariadne, which is for integrating archaeological information, Parthenos, which was for integrating humanities data, Shock, which is for integrating social sciences and humanity data. And there, the idea is basically these larger sector level organizations are being created at the European level, especially, I mean, Europe is investing a lot of money in it to try to create long-term sustainable data. And so they're trying to adopt and adapt CIDOC CRM to create specifications for having a long-term place to store and represent their data. And then two other kinds of work that are interesting to point to. So there's a national heritage organization in Canada called CHIN, and they're trying to create, they're trying to use CIDOC CRM to integrate museums data across Canada. So it's a national initiative. This logo is for the Swiss Art Research Initiative. They're trying to do a similar job in Switzerland. And then the last category to talk about is at an institutional level. So that's, I have these these icons here of the German National Museum, the Getty, the National Gallery, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. These are all examples of institutions which have different data structures which they need to manage over time, and especially they have a lot of research data that doesn't fit into a collection system, that doesn't fit into a library system, that doesn't fit into an archive system. And so oftentimes they're developing a strategy to create mappings between their institutional data, like their collection system, to research data, which is very specialized and can be done in different platforms. So those are 4 broad categories of use scenario that's actually going on. I don't have time to talk about this. I'll just say, because I promised I would mention it, talking about digital native CIDOC CRM data, if you're excited about creating data that would be born semantic and born compatible with CIDOC CRM or another ontology standard, then there are these 3 projects that I can refer to, the Whiskey Project, the Arches Project, and Research Space. They're all open source initiatives funded by different funding bodies, but which are trying to support researchers to create born CIDOC CRM data. And I will jump to the end of my presentation and say, I'm excited about CIDOC CRM. I hope I've somewhat excited you about its possibilities. And there's a lot to learn, but you can do a lot with it. It's very powerful. And I know your colleagues are already talking with you about that in the translation and so on. Anyhow, if you want to learn more, you can go to the official site. You can join our mailing list. If you want to do that, write to Martin and ask to join. There's an initiative by me, which is being extended, and colleagues, which is being extended to learn about it through a game. I think you'll be learning much more about that soon. So the original website is there. And then if you want to talk to other people who are doing large-scale modeling and integration with CIDOC CRM, then there are very many people you could talk to, but I just gave you 3 links here that could be of interest. The linked art project is very active. Linked conservation data is getting very active, and the Swiss Art Research Initiative is another one that gives you a lot of experience and stuff to work with. So I appreciate you listening to my talk. I hope I was clear. I hope I didn't speak too quickly for the interpreters, and I welcome any questions.
Дуже дякую, пане Джордж.
Thanks a lot, George. So, are there any questions in the audience right now? Please introduce yourself and then ask a question. Микола Панченко, can you hear me? So my question is as follows. As far as interaction between extensions of CRM are concerned, for example, we all know it perfectly well about the bibliographical domain. And we know that when we are describing a museum object or a thing, a physical thing, in bibliography, normally we have to provide a short description, right? So will there be real compatibility? Will there not be conflict between long names in extended bibliographical information with their ones which we have in the memory, in the documents on this object? That's my question.
Thank you. So the short answer is when you get to the actual stage of integration, in addition to, what you practically do is you go down to the data field level and you look at the data you're actually producing, and you give it a mapping to CIDOC CRM. If it's not analytic enough, if it's more textual, then it limits your ability to translate or to make connections across or to create a nice mapping. So oftentimes, if you have a very, an original data source which has a very textual background, then you need to do data splitting to join information. But of course, another strategy is just using authority data. So if you're linking over the bibliographic resource and you have, a DOI or something like that, then you can retain all of your original textual form data in its form and just make the connections via the DOI and represent your information unit that way and make a connection over to, say, the museum documentation by using the same DOI or other identifier, whatever it would be.
Дякую. Питання від Ольги Баркової.
Thank you. Here is the question from Olga Barkova in chat. So does Cdoc, or probably some of its branch system, performs certification of the system in terms of its compatibility with the CRM?
That's a great question.
Certification of information system.
That's a great question, and as of yet, no. We have a statement in the specification that indicates what you must do to be compatible, but we don't have an official certification process. It's been discussed, but at this moment, and for quite a few moments before this, we are a volunteer nonprofit organization, so the kind of machinery that would be necessary is not there, or at least at this point isn't there. On the other hand, it points to the practical question, and this is a major area of research and interest of mine, and generally in the semantic and CRM community. It points to the fact that if you adopt a standard like this, then you want to be standard. You want to be compatible with somebody else. And CIDOC CRM is actually, it gives you a language by which to re-express information, but it doesn't tell you how to use that language. It gives you the flexibility to express, to use its logical structures to make different choices on how you would represent the same information. So that's where these initiatives like, and that's by design. I mean, it's not supposed to tell you how to document, it's supposed to give you a way to re-represent your information. But initiatives like linked art and like the Swiss Art Research Initiative and like linked conservation data, what they're doing right now is assembling communities that do have the time, the funding, the initiative to decide how they want to use CIDOC CRM, and that they will use it in a particular way. For a particular problem, we will use it this way. And they document that and they put it up. And the point behind that will be to create, if not a place beyond information silos, at least much larger information silos of areas of compatibility where you can trust all this data has been expressed using the same principles. And in that direction, we'll probably arrive at being able to give a certification, because at that point, we'll be able to create, we'll be able to use different validation tools like Shackle or Shekel or other tools that are out there now for RDF data, so that we'll be able to make an objective. The problem is to be objective, to make an objective determination that X or Y really does satisfy using CRM in this way.
Thank you. So, as far as I know, when you mention the Swiss Research Institute, you speak about certain patterns of application, right?
Right.
But along with that, probably everyone who is willing to apply this model in practice is faced with some problems with practical implementation, in particular when the classical RDF doesn't allow you to apply all the variety of tools offered within the options offered within the CRM model. And I think that everyone has to find his own solution to the problem, like the properties of the properties or something like this.
That's, I mean, everybody does find their own solution. In CIDOC CRM SIG itself, to try to, like the CIDOC CRM SIG itself, its main mission is to develop and maintain the specification by which different systems can be integrated or elaborated. So it's not our main mission or competence to determine how implementations will happen. That being said, because we want to facilitate that integration works on the ground, we have parallel discussions within the SIG, producing documentation that lies outside of the specification, but which is recommendations for implementation within using a certain standard like RDF. So we actually have a document, a living document right now of RDF implementation suggestions, the official ones of CRM SIG. And we're continuously trying to keep up with actual practice. So another big area that I'm talking about now with the Canadian Heritage Information Network, CHIN, is the use of name graphs. And consistent use of name graph for managing data integration, but also provenance of information within a data model, which everybody does their own way. And it would be nice to leverage the fact that everybody wants to speak the same language to come up with some recommendations on the best way to do it. And in fact, and one other point, sorry, but for linked art in particular, they also are developing alongside their modeling choices, they're developing an API so that they will say, we made these modeling choices and you can systematically access data in JSON LD this way from our modeling choices.
А можна попросити ще декілька слів сказати про...
Could you please tell us a couple of more words about the trends, about the tendencies in the development of the standard? For example, in Ukraine, we worked more on the official level. I mean, we officially worked with the version which is official. This is ISO 21 and something, right? This is version 504. So what changes exactly in 7.1? Is it class generalization? Maybe you reject some classes which are more specific. So what are the trends in the development of the model? What are the changes?
Thanks for the question. So the trends in the development are really pushed by this family model system. So once we decided to talk about, to integrate with geographic information systems, then it brings in a whole bunch of questions we didn't have before. Once we decided to talk about scientific practice, it brings in a bunch of questions that we didn't talk about before. So to give you a practical example, we have in CRM SIG, there's a new event class called observation. And observation is more general than measurement, which is a class in CRM base. And it has to do with, and it's suddenly moved us from museum documentation in a strict sense to being able to look at, you know, the speed of liquids or the speed of transmission of some sort of particle through an air tunnel or something like that. So it creates the need for new higher level classes like observable entity, which is a generalization over persistent items and temporal entities. So that one, but we're very conservative. We try to be very conservative. So we only move classes that we absolutely think are useful to everyone up into the higher level standard. So when I pointed to those new relationships that connect to the space primitive, those were examples of something that came out of CRM Geo, which is a very intricate standard for talking about, you know, how I set up a base system for determining places and where I set up my measurement station, my total station, and what points I took and blah, 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 which is not useful for everyone. But everybody now is getting the output of GIS system information, which they're putting into their documentation system. So that drives into the top level standard now. So it's kind of a judgment call, but we do it democratically. And like I said, basically, things that appear generally useful and necessary to everyone, we move up into the base standard, and we try to make changes that don't make breaking changes for you if you're already using CRM 5.0.4. So if we make a breaking change, we're also releasing a document that gives you a migration path. So I'll just give two examples. We had a bunch of subclasses of appellation, actor appellation, place appellation, yada, yada. Nobody used them well, and they weren't particularly useful in the first place. So we made the decision to get rid of them, and that's an annoyance to somebody who has data in that format, but it's a simple fix because you just have to migrate everything up one step. There's nothing ontologically different, basically. But you have a different and bigger problem where you have these geographic coordinates where before you would have modeled it in a completely different way. So there we're trying to describe a translation path and say, if you modeled according to orthodoxy in the past, you would have put it under spatial coordinate. Now it's not spatial coordinate, it's this thing. This is how you should rewrite the information. Yeah, basically, now that we've written 7.1, we should also write a document. I mean, we're writing the translation thing, but we should write a document that tells the community all of the beautiful things that you get in 7.1 that you didn't have in 5. But it's basically space-time reasoning, being able to talk about geographic things, and a lot of cleaning up of the model so that you don't have these small level classes that didn't really make sense. In a nutshell.
Дякую. Дуже дякую.
Thanks a lot. One more question from chat. Besides Europeana, what other integrated resources and databases is CRM using? As far as I understand, Europeana is mediated by CIDOC standard, right? Which is compatible with CRM.
Yes, and the Europeana data model is its event orientation was adopted to allow easy integration across with Cdoc CRM, so it's just more abstract. Aside from if the point of the question is what are the large-scale data structures that are adopting or making data available in Cdoc CRM, then the answer is that the Getty is making an initiative to make all of their data available in Cdoc CRM using the linked art modeling. All the institutions that you'll find in the linked art group are committing towards doing that. The Swiss Art Research Institute is also trying to become a hub for exchanging information. The Canadian Heritage Institute is likewise doing these things. And then you often see integrations at an institutional level, or at a project level. So the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, they've adopted Cdoc CRM as their final storage format. So when they have new projects, they will model things in Cdoc CRM, and that means they can keep them long-term. So this is also happening in these various different European projects. The main problem, and to point at the elephant, is to have Europeana is good because it's there and it's stable and it's committed to its data, so all these other projects, if you're saying I want to go and grab Cdoc CRM data that's available now. Many of them are in the build phase in terms of linked art is trying to get everybody in America to play nicely in the same way. Chin is trying to get everybody in Canada to play nicely and in the same way. And so it's kind of a bootstrapping process of doing the modeling, doing the transformation, and then having the institutional support like Europeana has long-term funding to make sure that the data is available long-term. So hopefully, if you ask me the question again in a year's time and 2 years' time and so on, I will list more steady Sparkle endpoints where I can say you can grab data from there and it's certified to this modeling version of Cdoc CRM. But those are the obvious ones I can point to now.
Дякую. Чи є ще питання?
Thank you. Any other questions? So, dear colleagues, if anyone is still willing to ask questions, feel free to. I can see one hand raised. Anastasia, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, George, for your very informative and inspiration presentation. And I would like to ask you if some specific museum need CRM specialization, in which case this museum should enter own classes, and in which cases to use thesaurus outside of model?
That's a great question, and there's I mean, it's a bit of a question of art, essentially. It kind of depends on your implementation system. So if you're using an implementation system in which you definitely need to have a different data structure to hold your types, your different kinds of types, subclasses of types, then you're kind of forced to make your own subclasses. But generally, if you're considering that question in principle, then I would say that it's good to talk to a broader modeling community to see if you need the class. And that could be CRM SIG itself, or it could be places like Linked Art or SADI or Link Conservation Data, these different groups that are thinking about it anyhow. And I would also point to a project that's interesting and worth looking at. It's a tool called Ontome, ONTOME. And it's, I'll just drop it in the chat if I can, onto me. And it's a tool that was made partially for this initiative called Data for History. So if you look up Data for History and onto me, you'll find it. This is a tool for doing collaborative modeling. And so the idea is, if your museum is using Cdoc CRM for X, Y, or Z, and you want to have a discussion about how you're going to use it and what parts you're going to use, then it gives you the whole ontology, and you can choose classes and relationships you want and put them into a package and say, these are the ones we'll use. And you can also make new ones and relate them to the ontology, and have a conversation within the system about what it is and why you've made it. So you can document the sort of intellectual history of why you made a class or why you didn't make a class, and then share it with others. So it's quite I mean, it's also an open source project, so it doesn't have the most beautiful interface, but it does the job, and it will create an OWL RDF for you. So it's handy in that way.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Дуже дякую. Чи можливо?
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? If there are no more questions so far, there is still a question, right? As far as usage is concerned, practical implementation is concerned in the humanities, in museum databases. Do you have any bright examples of this?
I do. I'll just point at two. In fact, I'll share my screen briefly. So we're just going into my various things, but so a lot of work is going on behind the scenes, and so it might not be so very visible. But the Getty is doing a very big initiative, and so I will just point it to and just show you that there are real applications sitting in the back that are either generating data or waiting to accept data or getting things done. So this, for example, is the Arches platform, which is developed by a company called Firelon for the Getty. It's an open source platform, and it's meant to allow to create born CIDOC CRM data. And and this is a project called Arches for Science, or DISCO, and it's basically trying to create a standard set of models and standard workflows for collecting heritage science data. So documenting that you have a project, that you did observations, that you created data, the data is about this object is represented in this IIIF manifest, and so on and so forth. This tool is adopted by Getty Digital for all of Getty, and is what all research projects will be built out on. And then it implements the linked art modeling of CIDOC CRM, using CIDOC CRM that's created by the Linked Art Initiative. You can see that it's not just words, but whenever it loads, I'm loading from California, so it's a bit slow, that you actually have CIDOC CRM implemented, guiding the modeling and allowing you to create data presentation and data entry forms, and then create it in a way that will be compatible with a very large community. So that's one, and so this is one instance of an open source platform that you can download and use yourself tomorrow. It's, I mean, the three main things that I point to are Arches, whiskey. Now, whiskey is basically the same sort of thing that was developed by the German National Museum and is extensions to the Drupal system. But again, it's real digital humanities projects where you start with a question, you start with things you want to document, you do the modeling conceptually of CIDOC CRM, and then you can use the tools that they've created to create your own instance of a Drupal installation that allows you to enter data into a form that will be saved into a Drupal store, and which will then be manageable over time by the home institution, in this case the GNM, and connectable with other information. And I'm probably taking too long to answer your question. And to give an example, actually, of how this actually becomes useful in the long run, I was having a conversation on Twitter the other day with one of the curators of the Provenance Project at the Getty, and they're doing work on artwork that was involved in the Second World War and in the Holocaust, and has connections to various people who were, you know, murdered and so on and so forth. And they were looking for existing linked open data, authority records about the organizations and actors involved, because it's very complicated and tricky. And I was able to point them to an instance of whiskey that was developed in whiskey by the German National Museum, where they have a commitment to going through and doing the provenance of all of their potentially illegal objects. And they had the notebooks of the man whose name I forget, who was guided by, who was requested by Hitler to go and take all the major artworks from around Europe. So they did a tracing project of where all the artwork worked across Europe, and it's available open source. And so she was able to go and grab that data and reuse it in the provenance work at the Getty. So it does become practically useful over time.
Дякую.
Thank you. really, Whiskey, as for me, is a very comfortable instrument, comfortable tool for your first acquaintance with such systems. We tried to use it in our trainings, in particular last year, and I think that Mihailo remembers this because he was present at one of such trainings where we were creating training accounts in Whiskey, and probably you remember that we worked in groups. We tried to develop some small but basic tools of data and examples of databases. Thanks a lot. So any other questions? So if there are no more questions, thanks a lot, Mr. Braskera.